Before the sky split into gold and the Nile stirred with a hush of lotus blooms greeting the dawn, there was a silencer, silence that reached back through forgotten centuries, brushing over the broken teeth of ancient pyramids, sliding through the hollowed-out temples where priests once whispered secrets to gods, who now slumber in fractured stone, and in that silence, as shadows curled along the alabaster columns of the ruined temple of Deir el-Bahari, a low wind stirred scattering pale dust across the face of a scroll long buried beneath layers of time and neglect. In a quiet corner of a Cairo museum, where visitors rarely linger and the air always smells faintly of linen and parchment, an old man named Amir, whose spine had begun to bow like the delicate reeds he once watched sway in the Nile breeze as a boy, unrolled a brittle papyrus that had arrived in a crate marked only with the faded glyph of a falcon. And as the cracked fibers sighed beneath his fingertips, he did not know that he was the first in 3,000 years to touch the words of Hatshepsut, the Pharaoh king, whose name had been etched from memory, but whose voice now trembled once again through the inked loops of the forgotten scroll. The scroll began not with declaration, but with longing, with the voice of a young girl named Neferet, who had once walked barefoot along the cool marble of palace halls, whose laughter had echoed like the striking of silver against water, and whose fate was tied not only to the house of Pharaoh, but to something deeper, older, and more buried than any tomb beneath the Valley of Kings. And it was her story told in her own hand that now breathed life into the ancient fibers before Amir's eyes. Neferet had not been born of royal blood, though her beauty was said to rival Hathor, and her mind was sharper than the obsidian blades carried by the Magi guards who watched the palace walls. And when she was chosen at 13 summers to serve in the temple of Ammon, none questioned the god's will, for her dreams had long been haunted by figures clad in blue lotus and starlight, whispering names lost to man, and it was these visions that led the high priest to declare her marked by divinity. From the temple's towering gates, carved with jackals and rising suns, to the shadowed sanctum where only the most pure could approach the altar, Neferet passed in silence, her gaze never faltering, even when the sacred leopard of Bastet padded beside her, unbidden, its golden eyes watching her with a knowing that seemed far older than even the gods themselves. And it was said in whispers that the moment the beast bowed its head to her, the statues within the chamber exhaled a breath they had held for centuries. In the days that followed, Neferet began her study not only of herbs and hymns, but of hidden languages, of ciphers etched into the folds of mummy wrappings, of stars traced in silver dust upon black papyrus. And as the years unfurled like petals in the heat of Ra's noonday gaze, she grew into a woman of impossible grace and unnerving calm, her eyes always drifting to the horizon, as though waiting for something she could not name, something buried not in the sand, but in memory. It was during the Feast of Opet, when banners fluttered like flames and incense clouded the sky in wreaths of myrrh and cinnamon, that Neferet met Hatshepsut, not the pharaoh adorned in gold and false beard, but the woman beneath the crown, cloaked in plain linen to walk among her people, curious and unseen. And it was in the cool shadows of a colonnade that their eyes met, and the world, it seemed, paused, as though recognizing an echo. Their conversations began in riddles and ended in truths neither expected. For while Neferet spoke in the language of stars and omens, Hatshepsut responded in dreams, recounting visions of twin serpents twined around a sun disk, of doors opening beneath temples lost to the shifting sands, and together they formed a bond not of queen and subject, but of soul and mirror, each seeing in the other the shape of something incomplete now made whole. For many moons they met in secret, in the hidden chambers beneath the palace archives, where scrolls wrapped in crocodile hide whispered secrets from the first time, and it was there that they uncovered the prophecy, the one written in the blood ink of an oracle drowned in the Red Sea, the one that spoke of a priestess with the mark of the sun who would awaken the eye of Ra, and bring balance before the eclipse devoured the two lands. It was Neferet who wore the mark, though she never knew it, a sigil shaped like the lotus in bloom, that had always been hidden beneath her shoulder blade. And when Hatshepsut traced it with trembling fingers, lit by the flickering flame of a single oil lamp, the very walls seemed to lean in, listening. But knowledge, like gold, draws both kings and jackals, and word of their alliance, though whispered only in the hush of night, reached the ears of Setnamort, the vizier whose loyalty lay first with order and only then with truth, and fearing what such a union might awaken, he began to weave a net of silence and suspicion around them, his spies dressed as temple guards, his scribes forging new records to erase old ones. On the eve of the next full moon, Neferet was taken quietly, without struggle, for she had foreseen it in her dreams, and though the guards carried her gently, bound in veils scented with cedar to preserve her purity, the temple fell into mourning, and the leopard that had followed her since girlhood vanished into the night, never to return. Hatshepsut, upon hearing of Neferet's disappearance, did not rage nor weep, but instead entered the inner sanctum of the temple of Karnak alone, barefoot and veiled, and there she lay upon the cold stone before the statue of Ammon, whispering a vow that if the gods would not return her priestess, she would become a god herself. And thus began the true story of her transformation, not of bloodline, but of will. Amir's hands trembled as he reached the end of the scroll's first chapter, for though the language was ancient and the ink faded, the emotion pulsed through each symbol like the beat of a living heart, and for a long time, he sat in the silence of that museum room, listening to the echo of voices that had not spoken in millennia, and in his chest, something shifted, something that told him this was only the beginning. Far across the desert, beneath the restless sand of a forgotten necropolis, something stirred a tremble, no more than a breath, as if the earth remembered a promise once made beneath stars no longer visible, and as the night deepened, the wind carried a single word across the dunes, Nefret. And so, as the elder's final syllable dissolved into the hush of the chamber, and the flicker of the oil lamp cast an amber glow that danced like ancient spirits upon the rough earthen walls, the boy with eyes like midnight and curiosity like wildfire leaned in further, his breath shallow, his thoughts chasing shadows that might reveal the truths buried beneath centuries of dust and silence, unaware that his innocent question about why the city's old well had been sealed with bronze and guarded for generations was about to unearth a story so twisted in pain and brilliance that it had nearly been erased from the oral histories by those too afraid to speak it aloud. For there was once a time, the elder whispered, where the sacred well was not just a well but the center of all life in the sun-baked city that thrived between the dunes, a place where travelers came not to drink, but to remember, where the water shimmered with the reflections of every soul who had peered into its depths, where truths too terrible or beautiful to hold in the heart would emerge in silent images that danced across its surface, like forgotten gods mourning their own fading relevance. And in those years, long before the pharaohs had risen before the great pyramids clawed at the sky with stone, ambitions before names were etched in gold or power was sealed in scarab rings, there lived a woman of no title and no lineage, a potter's daughter, who sang to her clay and shaped vessels that were rumored to hold more than just water or oil for those who drank from her jars, claimed they saw visions of other lifetimes, other faces, other cities lit by moons not known to this world. Her name, though forbidden now, was whispered once in the shadowed corners of dying taverns as Nefshet, and though the priests eventually condemned her as a blasphemer and a witch, there were those who remembered the way she moved through the city, not with arrogance, but with the quiet gravity of someone who belonged more to dreams than daylight, whose eyes did not just see, but understood. And when she first came to the well, her bare feet stirring the dust that had not been touched by sandals in decades, those who watched from behind pillars or beneath shaded hoods felt a tremor in the air, like the moment before a storm when even the birds fall silent and the desert holds its breath. As the warmth of midday waned and the soft hush of afternoon light poured in golden streaks through the finely carved sandstone windows of their humble courtyard home, Izit and Menka found themselves once again sitting in the shade of the fig tree whose branches reached up like crooked arms to hold the whispering sky. And there, amidst the low murmur of distant merchants, the shuffle of camel hooves, and the fading laughter of children darting between alleyways, the young family shared a silence not born of boredom or distance but of something older, deeper, a silence that belonged to those who knew the rhythm of one another. Breath and the shape of shared dreams carved slowly into the clay of ordinary days, and as the light waned from the edges of the sky, replaced by the soft embers of twilight that flickered across the low dunes and pale city walls, she realized that the silence wasn't absence, but presence, the presence of things left unsaid, memories pushed deep into the folds of time, and ancient voices that seemed to hum just beneath the threshold of hearing, guiding her feet forward as if she were retracing the very footprints of those who had once walked here, those who had dreamed and fought, and danced in the flicker of firelight when this place was new and the sky hung heavier with stars. With each step through the crumbling stone archways and time-worn columns still etched with the faint curling lines of forgotten languages, her breath deepened not out of exhaustion but reverence, for even in ruin the city spoke of order and wisdom and purpose, of a people who had shaped their world with more than hands. They had shaped it with beliefs, rituals, and the rhythm of stories passed from lip to lip like sacred fire. And when she reached the center of the plaza, where a long-dried fountain stood, surrounded by broken pillars and the remnants of what might have been a place of gathering or judgment or joy, she touched the smoothest of the stones, one that still held the faint shimmer of polished purpose, and in that touch came the unmistakable sensation that she was not the first to feel awe here, that 1,000 years ago another had stood in this exact place, overcome with the same wonder, perhaps clutching a child's hand or whispering a name to the wind. The breeze stirred again, lifting her hair and carrying with it a scent she could not name, neither floral nor bitter, but somehow medicinal, sacred, like the incense of temples or the smoke from an offering, and she imagined the ancient priests in their linen robes trailing along these paths, singing prayers in voices that echoed not just off walls but into hearts. Then from behind the walls came a rustle, not threatening but curious, like the whisper of robes or the shifting of sand under a careful step, and she turned slowly, instinctively, as though she already knew what she'd see, and there, silhouetted in the descending dusk, was the figure of a boy no older than 10, barefoot, hair curled in ringlets, eyes wide not with fear but recognition, like he had been waiting for her, like he had seen her before in another age. He did not speak, and neither did she, for their silence was more eloquent than words, and when he motioned with a slight tilt of his head, she followed, not questioning why or where, but feeling deep in her marrow that this was the path she was meant to take, that this moment had unfolded across centuries just for this. The narrow corridor they entered was dark at first, but as their steps echoed against the wall's faint carvings, began to glow not with light but with memory, depicting scenes of feasts and funerals, of celestial alignments and rituals that involved both joy and mourning. And she realized these walls were not stone but stories, every surface etched with emotion as much as imagery. When the boy stopped before a door, a low, rounded slab of wood framed by sun-bleached stone, she noticed his hands trembling slightly as he pushed it open, revealing a chamber that seemed impossibly preserved, lit by the last threads of sunlight filtering through a circular opening above, and within lay objects so familiar yet distant, a bowl still holding dried figs, a mat still bearing the imprint of a resting body, and in the far corner, a statue of a woman holding a child close to her chest. The statue was small but powerful, carved from obsidian or something darker still, and as she approached it, she felt the weight of generations pressing gently upon her shoulders, not burdensome but grounding, like every life that had come before was nudging her forward, whispering their truths in 1,000 quiet voices. And in that space, sacred and still, she sat, cross-legged on the woven mat, hands on her knees, eyes closed, and breath not just air but history, the breath of the old world that still lingered in corners and cracks. And as she inhaled, she could almost taste the stories, rich and strange and layered with years. When she opened her eyes again, the boy was gone, as if he had never been, or perhaps had only ever existed for that moment. And though a pang of loneliness flickered in her chest, it was quickly replaced by something deeper, a knowing, a warmth, the kind that fills the empty spaces between heartbeats. The chamber darkened slowly as night finally claimed the sky, and she rose, stepping back into the corridor, then into the open square, the stars now glinting above like scattered pieces of the same story, and in those constellations she saw not just light but lineage, the journey of people, of places, of purpose. And so, beneath that ancient sky, in the heart of a forgotten city, she walked back through the silence, not as a visitor, but as a keeper of its truths. And so the sun dipped lower behind the timeless hills as the caravan reached the fringe of what once had been the forgotten gardens of Anotman, now choked with weeds and moss, but still whispering with the echoes of forgotten footsteps where our cloaked travelers dismounted with weary but determined motion, their eyes scanning the tangled green for a path that may no longer exist, yet their hearts beating in silent rhythm with the memory of the story they carried, a story that had grown heavier with each breath. And in that moment between the wind stilling and the crickets waking, the youngest among them, the scribe whose name had not been spoken aloud since the third night of travel, whispered, "This is the place," and though his voice was barely louder than the rustling leaves, it rooted every foot to the earth as though thunder had sounded beneath it. And just as the exhausted laborers began to slump under the fading sun, heat, and the little children with sunburnt noses whimpered beside the wagons waiting for a sip of warm water from the shared goatskin flask, a rustling came from the nearby ravine where shadows stretched long across the carved stones that once bore silent witness to gods and kings long forgotten, and a woman with silver-touched hair, her face weathered like cracked parchment, stepped into the clearing with an animal pelt wrapped around her shoulders and a stick in her hand carved with ancient sigils. And though no one knew her name, they all knew her stories, and they leaned forward as the fire was lit, and her voice, slow and deliberate, began to weave the tale of the city that slept beneath the earth, a place so silent that not even the gods dared disturb its slumber. And with every word she uttered a chill crept into the warm desert air, making the children huddle closer to their parents, and the guards grip their spears a little tighter, for in that tale was not only the memory of what once was, but a warning of what might return, if they strayed too far from the old paths. And as her tale reached its peak with shadow beasts, roaming hollow temples and silent screams echoing through crumbling stone, the fire hissed, and the wind howled down the canyon like a whisper from a forgotten time. And though no one said a word, every heart beat a little faster in that silence. And when morning came, the caravan moved slower, more cautious, as if the story itself had weighted their feet, and the sky was streaked with golden ash, and flocks of black-winged birds flew in strange spirals overhead, while a sickly sweet smell wafted from the eastern dunes where no one dared walk. And though no maps showed any danger, the elders muttered old prayers beneath their breath and avoided looking east. And the children no longer played as freely, choosing instead to cling to their mothers or quietly follow the priests who walked with solemn steps, sprinkling ground herbs and mumbling invocations to ward off what could not be seen. And as the sun reached its cruelest angle, a boy named Imsikma, whose eyes were always too curious for his own good, wandered off toward a strange stone formation that jutted like a broken tooth from the sand. And when they found him, his skin was cold though the sun blazed, and his lips murmured words in a tongue no one had taught him. And though he was carried back and washed and anointed, he would not speak again for many days. And when he did, it was only to say that the stone had eyes and they were watching, always watching. The decision was made swiftly and without open debate to avoid that path entirely, to steer the caravan westward even if it added 3 days to their journey, even if the terrain grew harsher and less forgiving, for no one wanted to walk under the gaze of that ancient stone. And as they turned their course, strange symbols appeared in the sand behind them, etched not by man or beast, but as though the desert itself had decided to write again. Long curling lines and sharp angular shapes that pulsed faintly under moonlight and vanished with the morning wind. And still they marched, their supplies dwindling and tempers fraying, yet no one dared question the detour, not after the whispers began, not after one of the guards slit his own palm and painted runes on his tent walls, claiming the symbols kept the dreams away, dreams of stone mouths whispering truths and lies all at once, dreams of cities beneath the earth where people moved like shadows and time had no meaning. As the terrain shifted into broken hills and jagged cliffs, where the wind screamed through narrow passes and carrion birds circled even in clear skies, the caravan stumbled upon a ruined shrine half swallowed by rock, and though its columns had collapsed and its altar lay split in two, The carvings upon the shattered walls still burned with meaning lines of figures with serpent eyes and mouths stitched shut, kneeling before a being too large and abstract to comprehend. And while the priests debated whether to record or rebury the site, a child began humming a tune none had heard before, a slow, spiraling melody that made even the camels stamp nervously. And when questioned, the child simply shrugged and said, "The stone people taught me," and no more was spoken of it. Yet from that day on, she never walked in her own shadow again. Nightfall came like a velvet curtain soaked in ink, thick and choking. And as stars blinked into existence above, so too did shapes move across the ridge, slow and silent, like memories with legs. And though the watchman held torches high and shouted challenges into the dark, no response came, only the rustle of movement and the sudden silence of crickets. And when dawn finally burned away the fear, 3 wagons had been appended, yet nothing was stolen. And the tracks left behind were too large to be human, too deliberate to be beast. And from then on, they traveled in tighter formation, keeping the children within the innermost circle and praying that whatever followed would lose interest, though deep down, they all knew it wouldn't. For curiosity once awakened cannot be lulled back to sleep. As the dim light of the oil lamp cast flickering shadows on the villa walls, and the scent of incense coiled softly through the air like whispered secrets, our story gently picks up again where we last left it, drifting through time's curtain into a world half forgotten and fully captivating, where whispers of desire and politics mingle in marble courtyards and quiet triclinium. Lucia, now older and married to Gaius, had grown into her role as matron with the kind of calm elegance only the Roman elite were taught to master. And though her marriage had been arranged for prestige and property, not passion, she had cultivated a graceful life of routines, hosting salons for poets and philosophers, managing slaves with calculated kindness, and quietly observing the games of love, played in her presence by others with a detached fascination that masked a quietly flickering curiosity beneath her. One summer afternoon, with the cicadas humming like a mantra in the heat outside and the marble tiles cool beneath their bare feet, Lucia and her childhood friend Aaliyah found themselves alone in the garden peristyle, the air thick with the scent of rosewater and myrrh, where their conversation turned, as it often did, to matters that society forbade them from speaking of aloud, but which pulsed through every facet of Roman life: desire, control, and the tangled tapestry of power that governed who was allowed to want, and who was expected to wait. Aaliyah, who had never married and lived as the wealthy daughter of a senator with a scandalously independent streak, leaned in and whispered about a whispered gathering she had attended the week before. A private convivium hosted by the notorious poet Rufinus, where wine flowed like the Tiber and masks allowed senators, scribes, gladiators, and courtesans to mingle as equals under the veil of anonymity and intoxication. Lucia listened with eyes wide but mouth still, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of a mosaic tile as Aaliyah painted pictures of rooms lit only by candlelight, bodies speaking through gesture instead of words, and rules that were suspended like cloaks at the door, revealing a Rome beneath Rome, where the rigid structures of class and marriage loosened and something more primal emerged. That night Lucia couldn't sleep, the images Aaliyah had described replaying behind her closed eyes, not with envy, but with a strange sense of possibility, as if she had glimpsed a life she might have lived had she taken a single different step many years ago. And though she loved Gaius in the dutiful, respectful way she had been taught, there was a space inside her vast and echoing that had never been filled, not by status, not by routine, and certainly not by the perfunctory embraces shared in the dark corners of their marital bed. In the days that followed, Lucia began to observe more closely the quiet mechanics of affection in her own home and beyond, noticing the lingering glance between 2 male servants as they passed each other in the atrium, the subtle brush of a courtesan's fingers against the shoulder of a merchant at the baths, and the way old Senator Marulus always arrived late to the theater with a boy no one dared name but everyone recognized. She began to keep a private journal, hidden behind a false wall in her dressing chamber, where she recorded not just what she saw, but how it made her feel, a swell of curiosity. A pulse of longing, and above all, a dawning realization that sex in Rome, though tightly scripted in public, was a sprawling, messy, beautiful mosaic in private with as many colors and configurations as there were people living within its walls. When a letter arrived from her cousin Marcus, inviting her to spend a fortnight at his estate in Baya, coastal town known for its hot springs, pleasure gardens, and quiet reputations, Lucia accepted without hesitation, citing her need for rest, though she packed her most revealing tunics and the red coral pendant she had once worn only in her youth, as if some part of her anticipated that she might need to remember what it felt like to be seen as something more than a mother and a matron. Baya did not disappoint. The sea air was thick with salt and laughter, and the nights stretched long and silken, filled with music drifting from unseen lutes and the soft laughter of lovers beneath pergolas entwined with grapevines. And it was here, on the third night, that she met Darius. Darius was a freedman of Greek descent, employed as a steward to her cousin, tall and dark-eyed, with a voice that sounded like it had been aged in amphory. And he spoke to her with a gentleness that was rare and a familiarity that was forbidden. And though their early conversations were about wine vintages and villa architecture, something shimmered beneath the surface, like heat rising from paving stones. It was not a seduction, not at first, but a slow awakening, a recognition, a question unspoken that hung in the air between them like perfume. And when, one evening, he reached to adjust the clasp of her necklace and his fingers brushed the skin of her neck, she felt the world tilt slightly, as if gravity itself had remembered her. In the days that followed, Lucia and Darius found reasons to linger alone together, discussing menu plans in the garden, alcove reviewing servant duties by the baths, and each moment was thick with unsaid things, attention. A symphony played in silence until one night, beneath a moon that hung like a peeled grape in the sky, she followed him to the old bathhouse after dinner, saying only that she had trouble sleeping. The bathhouse was quiet, lit only by a few low-burning torches, and the water shimmered gold and black, and there, without words, without need for performance or pretense, they undressed, not just in fabric but in fear, in expectation, in all the layers society had wrapped around them. And what followed was not an affair, not a scandal, but a rediscovery, a reverent ritual of touch and breath and presence. And in the days that followed, Lucia did not feel guilt, but a fullness she had never known, not from power or wealth or propriety, but from the simple, radical act of being wanted not as an ornament, not as a matron, but as a woman, whole and unscripted. But Rome is never far, even in Baiae, and whispers travel faster than ships. And when Gaius arrived unannounced on the seventh day, bearing a scroll with Senate matters and suspicion, the world Lucia had tasted began to tilt again, not in awakening this time, but in reckoning. Let us pause here, not in fear, not in regret, but in the quiet moment before choice, as the moonlight still lingers on the surface of the bathhouse water, and Lucia stands at a threshold between two Romes, the one she was born into, and the one she glimpsed in a kiss. As the torches flickered against the time-worn frescoes and the heavy hush of midnight settled over the domus, Claudia and Marcus stood in the corridor just beyond the atrium, their eyes still adjusting to the dim lamplight as their footsteps echoed softly over the mosaic floors, and Claudia, with a glance over her shoulder to ensure no servant stirred in the shadows, led Marcus through a hidden passage at the edge of the peristyle garden that wound downward into the belly of the house, a place where air grew damp and cool, and the scent of earth mingled with stored amphorae of wine and oil. Their silence, broken only by the gentle lapping of water from an underground cistern, a private retreat, passed down through generations known only to the matriarchs of Claudia's lineage. And here, under the solemn gaze of painted lares on the walls, she spoke of secrets long buried, of women who resisted arranged fates and forged their own paths in quiet rebellion, drawing Marcus deeper into a tale as ancient as the city itself, where pleasure and power, obedience and freedom danced an eternal dance beneath the veils of Roman virtue. In the chambers of the elite, pleasure was not merely physical but theatrical, a staged ballet of anticipation and suggestion, and Claudia, raised not just to marry but to manipulate, had mastered the art of silent command, of drawing men not with words but with posture, with the tilt of a chin, the delay of a touch. And in this hidden vault lit by the soft blue glow of glass beads, suspended like stars from a bronze chandelier, she revealed to Marcus a cache of silken garments, scented oils and small ivory instruments, relics of femininity preserved like holy offerings, each with a story etched in memory, handed down with hushed reverence. And as Marcus ran his fingers over an embroidered tunic stitched with mythical scenes, he listened, enraptured, as Claudia told of her great-aunt Livia, who once seduced a senator not with beauty, but with knowledge of Greek verse, or of Sabina, who ruled her household like a general, her will as sharp as any gladius. And in these tales Marcus saw the shadow Rome dared not speak of, the empire within the empire, governed by women in whispered legacy. Meanwhile, in the modest domus on the Aventine Hill, a different world unfolded, where Emilia, once a slave and now freedwoman, kept her own ledger of stories, carved not in scrolls but in memory and the cadence of gossip traded in the laundries and marketplaces, and her small home, cluttered with trinkets of colored glass, scraps of old fabrics, and dried bundles of herbs, had become a quiet sanctuary for women who had nowhere else to speak freely, where old mothers reminisced about vanished loves and young girls giggled behind sleeves about their secret admirers, where laughter and tears flowed with equal ease. And here, under the aroma of spiced wine and warm bread, S3X was not a transaction but a mosaic of longing, survival, affection, and escape, told in stories where even the poorest woman could be queen for a night, if she chose to be. Farther still, across the Tiber in the Subura district where Rome pulsed raw and unfiltered, a girl named Tertia, not yet 15, ducked beneath hanging linens in an alleyway, her bare feet silent on the wet cobblestones as she delivered messages for her mother, who brewed herbal tinctures and read fortunes for coin. And though their home was no larger than a senator's wardrobe, Tertia's mind was a palace of wonder fed by stories overheard and stolen glances through cracked shutters. And in her dreams, she was a Vestal chosen not by fate but by fire itself, her purity not a gift to the gods but a weapon against them. And each day she grew older and braver, sketching poems on clay shards hidden beneath her cot, verses about bodies not owned but celebrated, about kisses as revolts, about the sacredness of saying no. At the same moment, in a candlelit corner of a brothel cloaked in plum curtains and perfumed shadows, a seasoned courtesan named Petronia recited lines from Ovid to a patrician youth who claimed to seek enlightenment, but whose trembling hands betrayed simpler desires, and she, with a smile older than his father, taught him not just the rhythm of flesh, but of feeling, explaining with patient grace how to listen, how to watch, how to leave no mark that was not wanted. And in that hour, as the night moaned beyond the walls and the city turned over in its restless sleep, he learned that pleasure was not conquest but communion, not taking but offering. And when he left, pockets lighter, heart heavier, Petronia added his name to her invisible scroll of those who almost understood. Back in the Palatine Palace, where the emperor dined under ceilings of gold leaf and crystal, a different kind of intimacy unfolded, one that involved no touch at all but the slow, sinuous bending of words and favor. And Octavia, half-sister to a man who ruled half the world, wielded her influence in whispers and nods, maneuvering her enemies into exile and her allies into comfort, with nothing more than carefully placed compliments and invitations to exclusive rites. And though the poets praised her chastity, they never saw the fire in her eyes when she read the Senate records or heard her voice, firm and low, when she met with foreign envoys. And in this rarefied air her greatest lover was Rome itself, a city she both worshipped and molded in secret with hands veiled in silk but forged of iron. On the coast of Ostia, as sea foam curled like lace against the piers and merchant ships moaned beneath the weight of distant spice and salt, a sailor named Lucius returned after 3 years abroad to find his wife Marcia changed not in body but in bearing her gaze, steadier, her laughter deeper, and as they lay together under the stars, she told him not of loneliness but of selfhood, how she'd learned to read and how she'd managed their tavern without him, how she'd danced at the festival of Flora and kissed a girl from Gaul. And Lucius, after a long silence, simply took her hand and pressed it to his chest, knowing the tides had changed and he must learn her anew, not as a possession returned, but a story still unfolding. In the temple of Vestal, where silence was sacred and touch forbidden, a novice named Livia watched the flames and thought not of duty, but of longing, not for a man or woman, but for a life she glimpsed only in stolen moments. Life where she could walk beyond the marble steps, remove the white veil, and speak her thoughts aloud without fear of sacrilege. And some nights, when the wind whispered through the open ceiling and rustled the sacred flame, she imagined the fire was a voice calling her to escape, and in those dreams she always ran barefoot through the forum, laughter bursting from her lips as the city's stone heart beat wildly with her own. Thus Rome spun on, a city of shadowed alleys and sunlit porticos, of whispered stories and shouted desires, and everywhere, in every class, behind every wall and beneath every toga, the truth of S3X was not a singular thing, but 1,000 lives layered one atop the other like sediment in the Tiber, telling a tale not of empire but of individuals, of moments stolen and memories etched, of resistance and surrender, of love both fleeting and eternal. And as the city prepared for another dawn, its people stirred in their beds, in their dreams, in their yearning, unaware that their small, private acts formed the true history of Rome, the kind never written in marble but in the breathless hush of shared intimacy, the flicker of candlelight on bare skin, and the gentle sighs that echoed long after the night had passed. And now, in a humble shop on the Via Sacra, where scrolls were copied by candlelight and ink-stained fingers worked late into the night, an old man named Gaius began to pen a record not for emperors or senators, but for the forgotten, writing in slow careful strokes the stories he heard from clients and lovers and strangers who trusted him with their truths. And he began with a sentence that would outlive him. In the quiet corners of this city, where marble does not reach and power does not tread, there lives another Roma, Rome of longing, of bodies and breath, of stories whispered not for glory but for remembrance. Welcome back, dear listener, to another journey through the candlelit corridors of forgotten time, where the shadows of memory stretch long and soft over the quiet stones of the past, and where once again we rejoin Gaius, now seated beneath the dim glow of an oil lamp in his little scriptorium nestled between the chipped marble walls of the old Via Sacra shop, his calloused fingers poised over a piece of worn parchment, the scratching of his reed pen the only sound that broke the silence as he continued writing the ancient stories whispered to him by time itself. It was a particularly quiet evening, the type where the city seemed to hold its breath, and the only movement came from the flickering shadows that danced along the ceiling as the lamplight trembled, casting Gaius in an amber hue. And as he dipped his pen again into the ink and looked out through the narrow window at the stars above the forum, he recalled a tale that had been half forgotten even in his youth, one that spoke of a mysterious woman known as Livia of the Wind, a courtesan, philosopher, and secret keeper whose footsteps had graced the chambers of senators and slaves alike, whose beauty was matched only by her cunning, and whose life had been stitched into the fabric of Rome, like a hidden thread of silk weaving its way through coarse linen. Livia had come from the eastern provinces, some whispered from Syria, others claimed from the Greek islands, but none could agree on her origin because Livia herself never said, her accent a melodic blend of many tongues, and her eyes one the color of stormy sea and the other like polished obsidian were said to see into men's ambitions with the clarity of a goddess. And though she owned no villa, no land, and bore no noble title, the elite of Rome would seek her counsel behind closed doors, for she possessed an uncanny ability to know things before they happened. Or perhaps, as Gaius mused, she merely understood the currents of power better than those who wielded it. It was in the year of the consul Gnaeus Domitius, when famine had brushed the Tiber's edge, and the people grumbled beneath the weight of tax collectors and unseasonal rains, that Livia's name began to appear in the quiet conversations of the Senate, not shouted from marble steps, but whispered in cloistered corners. For it was said that she had predicted the collapse of a grain fleet before it sailed, and when the ships indeed sank in the Mediterranean, their bellies bloated with soaked barley, senators began to consult her not just in shadows, but behind heavy curtains and through intermediaries who paid in coin, favors, or secrets. One such senator was Lucius Vibius, a man of austere reputation and brittle pride, who had built his name on military discipline and family legacy, yet found himself humbled in Livia's modest triclinium, seated on a cushion worn thin by years, sipping watered wine as she asked him questions not about politics, but about dreams, colors, and the things he feared most when the lamps were extinguished. And though Lucius laughed awkwardly at first, he later returned again and again, each visit leaving behind a part of his guarded self, until one day he confessed to her a plan to eliminate a rival through poison. And Livia, instead of recoiling, merely lit another stick of sandalwood incense and said, "Poison rarely kills the body, Lucius, it kills the soul first," a phrase that would haunt the senator until his dying breath, scribbled in trembling hand across a discarded scroll found in his study years later. And so Livia became not just a courtesan or prophetess, but a mirror in which Rome saw itself more clearly, a woman who held no sword yet disarmed legions with her questions, who wore no armor but whose silence could paralyze men of war. And though many tried to discredit her, to trap her with words or scandal, she slipped through their grasp like wind through a colonnade, leaving behind only the memory of her perfume and the echo of truths unspoken. Gaius paused, stretching his aching fingers, letting his mind drift as he listened to the sounds of the night, a distant wheel creaking, a dog barking in the Subura, the occasional rustle of parchment from the shelves beside him, and he thought not just of Livia, but of the power of stories, how they preserved not just facts, but feelings, how they allowed voices like hers to live beyond the reach of time's erosion. And as he dipped his pen once more, he decided to write the tale of Livia not as history, but as a letter, a confession, as if she herself were speaking across the centuries. "If you find this scroll," he imagined her saying, "know that I was never meant to be remembered, but I lived in every whisper of Rome, in every breath held between lies and truths, in the spaces men dared not name, and if you hear my voice now, then the wind still carries me through your world, and I am not lost." Single quotes. Thus the ink flowed again, forming sentences like tendrils reaching backward into shadow, and Gaius, though weary, felt no need to sleep, for tonight the city of Rome dreamed through him, and in that dream, Livia walked once more beneath the moonlight, her sandals silent on the ancient stones, her gaze fixed not on temples or thrones, but on the stars, reflected in the Tiber, whispering secrets to the water as she always had. And so, with the rain now beginning to gently kiss the tiled rooftops of the Via Sacra and the streetlights flickering with warm golden hues, Gaius, seated at his wooden writing desk, surrounded by the scrolls of his memories and dreams, dipped his stylus into the inkpot once more and began to write with a sudden sense of renewed purpose, the sounds of nightfall in Rome lulling the city into sleep as he penned the story of a young Vestal acolyte named Livia, whose eyes once sparkled brighter than the sacred flame she was sworn to protect, and whose journey into womanhood had been as tender as it was turbulent. Beginning on the day she first arrived at the house of the Vestals, clutching the hand of her mother, eyes wide with wonder and fear, unaware that her fate was sealed the moment her name had been chosen by the Pontifex Maximus in a ceremonial rite that echoed through the marble halls with divine authority. Livia, barely 6 years old at the time, had been plucked from her home in the Sabine countryside, her father a grain merchant and her mother a devout matron with ambitions for her daughter that stretched far beyond their modest means. And as the gates of the temple closed behind her with a solemn groan, the child felt the weight of her lineage, her duty, and the gods themselves settle on her small shoulders like the fine white linen robes she was soon adorned in, robes that would become her second skin, her shield, and sometimes her burden. The house of the Vestals, though cloistered in sanctity, pulsed with secret rhythms of sisterhood and sorrow, for behind the stoic faces of its elder priestesses lay stories of heartbreak, sacrifice, and desires buried deeper than the ashes of Vesta's eternal hearth. And young Livia, with her curious heart and delicate fingers that often lingered too long over forbidden scrolls, found herself enchanted by tales not found in doctrine, but whispered in the shadows of moonlit corridors, tales of love letters hidden in amphorae of glances, exchanged with gladiators during public ceremonies, and of silken tokens traded in defiance of vows. As the seasons shifted and the marble statues of goddesses gathered dust in their solemn niches, Livia bloomed like the spring violets near the Tiber, her body ripening beneath the modest tunics, her thoughts straying beyond the sacred scripts to the sculpted torsos of soldiers passing the temple gates. And it was during the festival of Paralia, amid the smoke of sacred fires and the laughter of Rome celebrating its shepherd origins, that she first met Marcus, a centurion's son with olive skin and storm-grey eyes who had wandered too close to the Vestal procession, their eyes locking across the throng like magnets drawn by a current neither understood. Their encounters were brief, guarded, and always under the guise of chance. A brush of fingers near a market stall, a scroll dropped in the forum, a whispered prayer that veiled a message. But in these fleeting moments, Livia felt a fire ignite within her that rivaled the eternal flame she was sworn to maintain, and though she knew the lodged a brutal consequence of being buried alive should her chastity be bridged, she also knew that within the chambers of her heart, another kind of sacred fire had been lit, one not of divine decree but of the raw, irrepressible truth of being alive. Gaius paused in his writing, his eyes heavy but his mind alight, and as thunder rolled distantly over the Aventine hill, he reached for a second scroll, the one containing his notes on the Lupana of Pompeii, where stories carved into stone and scratched into plaster told of another kind of devotion, one not to gods, but to flesh, to the pleasures of the moment. And as he unfurled the brittle parchment, he remembered his own visit to the ruins years ago, where he had traced the etched outline of Venus herself above the door of a narrow room, the stone bed within still bearing the ghosts of laughter and longing. That day, the guide, a sun-baked woman named Flavia, who wore a faded blue scarf and carried her grandfather's notebook, had told him of the courtesans whose names still survived in graffiti, like Amaryllis, famed for her silken touch and voice like honeyed wine, or Secunda, who once served senators and slaves alike with equal joy. And Gaius had imagined their lives in vivid color, the jingle of coin purses, the scented oils, the flicker of lamplight against bare skin, and the sounds that echoed through those narrow corridors long before Vesuvius turned all to ash and memory. And now, as he returned to his tale, Gaius wove these recollections into Livia's growing narrative, imagining a clandestine journey taken under the veil of night, her feet bare upon the mosaic stones as she slipped through the back gates of the temple into the winding alleys of the Subura, drawn by an ache she could no longer silence, a need to see Marcus once more, to feel something beyond the incense and scripture. And in those darkened streets, lined with taverns and brothels, she discovered a side of Rome she had only ever heard in cautionary whispers. A world where women wore color and spoke boldly, where pleasure was not a sin but a song. In a dim chamber above a perfumery, Livia met Amaryllis, herself now aged but no less enchanting, who had once lain with emperors and poets, and who now read fortunes in fig leaves and taught curious girls the art of touch. And under her guidance, Livia began to understand her body not as a temple guarded by fear, but as a vessel of wonder, a garden to be explored. And though she returned to the Vestals each dawn with knees scraped and heart pounding, she did so with a secret smile, her prayers now laced with the knowledge that the divine did not reside solely in abstinence but in the fullness of experience. Gaius's quill danced faster now, the ink flowing like a river, and as he glanced up briefly to the bust of Venus on his shelf, he thought of how little had changed through the centuries, how even now, behind curtains and closed doors, the same desires flickered like candlelight. And he returned to Livia's tale with renewed urgency, recounting how her world began to fracture the day a fellow Vestal, Julia, discovered the letter hidden beneath her cot, a love note penned in Marcus's strong hand, sealed with a pressed petal from a garden near the baths of Cacala. The confrontation was quiet but sharp, a dagger of words rather than steel, and Julia, torn between loyalty and jealousy, gave Livia a day to disappear, to flee the city or face the tribunal. And in that twilight, with her belongings wrapped in a simple cloth and her heart torn between duty and love, Livia stood once more at the temple gates, her hand upon the ancient wood, whispering a goodbye to the flame she had kept for 12 years, before vanishing into the mist like a ghost of Rome itself. Her story, one of many that would never be carved into marble, but would live on in parchment and memory, As the final sentence unfurled beneath Gaius's hand, he sat back with a sigh that seemed to echo through the empty shop, and the candle beside him flickered low, casting shadows of goddesses and ghosts upon the walls. And outside the rain had ceased, leaving the city washed and quiet, the streets gleaming like polished bronze under the moonlight, and in that stillness he knew that the stories of Rome's forgotten souls had found a new vessel, and that in the telling they were never truly lost. As the breeze carried the scent of crushed grapes and wild rosemary through the open shutters of Gaius' study, he dipped his quill in ink once again. The sound of distant foot traffic on the Via Sacra blending with the scratching of his pen as he resumed the story that had taken over his mind and soul like a fever that refused to break. For just as he had concluded his thoughts on the philosopher-priestess, whose secret rites shaped the morals of matrons and young maidens alike, he turned his memory toward the forgotten vices and whispered sins hidden behind the marble columns of patrician villas, those decadent banquets that began with poetry and ended in perfumed shadows where fidelity was exchanged for fleeting pleasure. In those great domes that lined the Esquiline hill, the boundaries between honor and desire blurred with the passing of wine goblets, where wives trained in rhetoric debated poets by day and indulged in masked affairs, by moonlight slipping out of their silken beds to rendezvous with gladiators and actors, men too lowly to enter by the front door, yet who found entry through secret garden gates and perfumed scrolls that carried more than mere verse. And Gaius, though he never named names, described the scenes with such vivid clarity that even the laziest imagination could see the flicker of oil lamps reflecting in the eyes of lovers, doomed to morning regret. He wrote of the curious practice of private theaters, not the grand public spectacles of the Colosseum, but intimate gatherings in hidden atriums where hired performers played out scandalous dramas, often starring their own patrons, whose pleasure was not merely in watching but in participating. Senators donning masks of shepherds and gods, their wives and slaves alike reciting verses thick with double meaning, their laughter echoing beneath painted ceilings as slaves poured wine and musicians struck notes meant to ignite, not soothe, the soul. It was here, in the retelling of one such evening, that Gaius let his imagination pour unfiltered onto the parchment, describing a villa just outside the city where the host, famously austere magistrate, had built a mirror-lined chamber to reflect every angle of his orgiastic gatherings, a space where no shadow could hide shame, where guests wore nothing but golden wreaths and the scent of myrrh, and where deals of power were sealed with shared bodies instead of ink, the Roman way of ensuring loyalty through shared secrets and mutual guilt. And in these scenes Gaius did not judge, for to judge would be to distance himself, and he, like Rome itself, was both spectator and participant, both historian and confessor, scribbling down these memories with a hand that trembled, not from age but from the intoxicating clarity of truth finally spoken after decades of silence. Truths wrapped in silk robes and echoing in the laughter of a senator's daughter who had once whispered in his ear a philosophy of pleasure older than Plato, deeper than Cicero, and infinitely more human. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting long golden shadows across the stones of the forum, and inside, Gaius lit another lamp, the flame flickering like the memory of a youthful tryst he once shared with a fellow scribe beneath the temple of Vestal, a moment so brief and yet so indelible that he still carried the scent of olive oil and parchment in his mind whenever he passed the place, a memory he now dared to immortalize on parchment, disguised as fiction but bearing all the weight of confession. The narrative wound forward into the tales of the Subura, Rome's teeming, dirty heart, where lust was sold cheaper than bread, and yet sometimes glowed more brightly than any noble affair. For here the stories were raw, unadorned by poetry, told in moans and gasps, and the clink of coins passed from calloused hands to painted palms. And Gaius, ever the wanderer, had once lived in a cramped room above a wine shop where the walls were thin and the education plentiful, and he remembered a woman named Livia whose voice had taught him more about longing than any verse by He wrote of her now, her breathy laugh, and the way she traced Latin letters onto his chest with her fingertip, how she spoke of gods and street fights in the same breath, her mouth tasting of fig and ash, her stories always half truth and half dream, until one day she was gone, vanished like so many in the underbelly of the city. Her memory lingering only in a ring she once left behind, now kept in a small wooden box beside his inkpot, a relic of the kind of love that Rome never recorded in statues or scrolls, but which lived forever in the spaces between the lines. Gaius paused, rubbed his tired eyes, then turned the page and continued the story, pulling him deeper into memory as he recalled the Saturnalia festival of his 31st year, a time when roles reversed and chaos reigned, and he, dressed as a slave, had been kissed by a patrician boy in a shadowed alcove, the kiss tasting of honey cakes and rebellion, the moment fleeting but electrifying, never spoken of again but burned into the flesh of his memory like a brand he would carry to his grave. Now, in his candlelit solitude, he gave life to these hidden histories, and as he wrote, the figures of his past seemed to rise around him. Livia leaning against his wall, the boy from Saturnalia smiling shyly, the magistrate beckoning from his mirrored chamber. All of them ghosts, yes, but not mournful, for they were finally being seen, remembered not in shame but in the full messy glory of who they had been, and in doing so, Gaius felt a strange sense of peace, as though the Rome he had known was unfolding once more through his ink, vibrant and alive even as its marble cracked and dust settled. He ended the night writing of a courtesan named Tertia, famed not just for her beauty, but for her wit, who held salons where generals wept and poets found clarity, who claimed that every moan held a truth, every sigh a story, and who once told Gaius that the greatest shame was not in desire, but in denying it. And those words, once scandalous, now felt like gospel as he penned them. Beneath the flickering lamp, the night air cool against his ink-stained fingers, the stars above, Rome glittering like the eyes of long-lost lovers come back to witness the final telling. And so, as the heavy heat of the Roman afternoon deepened, Gaius leaned back from the pages of the thick scroll he had just unrolled, its faded script whispering secrets long buried beneath the dust of decades. Stories of lives twisted and turned by lust, duty, politics, and the desperate hunger for control. And he found himself blinking slowly, for the inked lines he read seemed to breathe, drawing him into yet another layer of the past, one deeper still than before, a time when Empress Valeria was not yet empress, but merely the clever daughter of a provincial governor with a mind sharper than a legionnaire's gladius, and an ambition that reached for the heavens, her every move calculated within a society where women were decorations, unless they learned to wield power from behind veils and silks. And her story, barely remembered even in whispered gossip, now unfurled in elegant Latin before Gaius's eyes, revealing how Valeria, then barely 16, seduced, not with her body but with ideas, with whispered strategies that turned noble sons against their fathers, that helped her forge alliances through marriages she herself orchestrated from the shadows, and how, years later, she would become the secret architect behind the sudden rise of a forgotten general named Aeli, whose meteoric ascent to consul was believed to be divine will, but was in fact the final act in a decade-long strategy, penned by a girl who had once eavesdropped in a bathhouse to discover a senator's fatal weakness. Gaius's candle flickered low, casting long shadows over the parchment, as he carefully turned the page to find drawings, sketched not by a trained hand, but by someone desperate to record what words could not convey, a series of figures in contorted positions, ritualistic, sensual, reverent, and he realized they weren't simple depictions of sex, but ceremonial acts tied to ancient cults, particularly the cult of Bona Dea, whose rites had always been a source of controversy, mystery, and fear, for they were strictly forbidden to men. And yet here were records written in a masculine hand, perhaps a spy, a lover, or a traitor, describing how women of power gathered in hidden villas in the Alban hills under the full moon, donning veils of purple and green, whispering invocations to feminine deities older than the Roman pantheon, while engaging in rites that symbolized the cyclical power of creation, destruction, and rebirth, and how these acts, far from being merely carnal, were believed to strengthen fertility, influence political outcomes, and even sway the health of the empire itself. As he read on, Gaius felt a strange sensation creep through him, not just the chill of ancient knowledge, but the subtle pull of personal memory, for he began to recall his own grandmother's cryptic stories, half sung, half muttered, about women who wore perfume made from crushed violets and snake oil, who spoke to the moon and could tell when a man was lying just by the twitch in his foot. And he wondered whether some part of those ancient rites had survived in the kitchens and courtyards of common Roman homes, disguised as superstition but rooted in something far older, more potent, and dangerously female. And as he wrote his notes in the margin, he suddenly remembered a mosaic in the temple of Vestal he had seen as a boy, one that had confused him, then a woman seated on a throne of flames, holding not a scepter but a serpent surrounded by nude figures dancing in a spiral. And it struck him that perhaps the old temples had hidden more than relics, perhaps they were libraries of images meant only for those who could interpret their true meanings. There was a knock at his shop door, 3 slow raps, not urgent but deliberate, and Gaius stiffened, for no one came this late to the Via Sacra unless they sought discretion or danger, and when he opened the door he found a cloaked figure, face obscured, who handed him a small scroll sealed with wax, bearing the mark of the Pontifex Maximus, a sign of both supreme authority and lethal secrecy, and before he could speak the figure vanished into the darkness, leaving behind the faint scent of frankincense and myrrh, scents used in both temples and funerals. And with a trembling hand, Gaius broke the seal and read the short message within. Do not publish what you read. Meet me at the baths of Caracalla at the 2nd hour tomorrow. Sleep did not come that night. The next morning, wrapped in a simple tunic and the traveler's cloak, Gaius made his way through the busy streets of Rome, avoiding familiar paths, until he reached the towering columns and steaming domes of the baths of Caracalla, where senators, gladiators, and slaves alike mingled in the thermal waters. And it was there, near the caldarium, that he saw a man seated alone, his features obscured by the steam but his bearing unmistakable, regal still, commanding. And as Gaius approached, the man gestured for him to sit without looking, and only when they were shoulder to shoulder did he speak, his voice like gravel. What you read belongs to the Vestals. It was never meant to be found. Gaius, though his heart thudded in his chest, answered with calm, but it was written, and preserved. Someone wanted it remembered. The man turned, revealing eyes that had seen too much. Not remembered, hidden. Some truths do not free men, they destroy them. And thus began another tale, deeper and more treacherous than the last, a descent into the underbelly of Roman religion, where power did not wear togas or crowns, but hid behind incense, symbols, and the blood of forgotten rituals. Gaius sat still for a long moment after the last customer left his modest bookshop on the Via Sacra, the dusty scrolls stacked in quiet columns around him like forgotten monuments of memory, his ink-stained fingers trembling slightly from the intensity of what he had just written, tales of empresses and slaves, of whispered trysts beneath marble archways and passion hidden behind the drapes of senatorial chambers. And as the last rays of the Roman sun dipped behind the temple of Vestal, he rolled out a fresh scroll, dipped his stylus into the jar of thick black ink, and began to write again, his heart beating to the rhythm of memory. He remembered how, in the heart of the Subura, a boy named Drusus once followed his father through narrow alleys, past the shadowed doors of brothels and perfumed bathhouses, asking innocent questions with wide eyes, while his father, a freedman turned silk trader, answered with dry, evasive mutters, until they came upon a temple dedicated to Venus Clausina, the goddess of love and sewers, where a priestess, draped in translucent linen, stood outside blessing passing couples with olive branches dipped in scented water, her lips murmuring verses older than the stones beneath their feet. And Gaius remembered the stories the merchants told when they gathered at dusk by the fountains to sip watered wine and share tales from the province. How in faraway Gaul Roman officers took local women not just as lovers, but as status symbols, dressing them in Roman tunics and parading them through camps like trophies, while in Egypt, the soldiers whispered about priestesses of Isis who taught them pleasures Roman matrons would blush to hear. He recalled how the scribes in the library of Alexandria once debated whether the Emperor Caligula's rumored nightly orgies were debauchery or divine right, whether his temple to himself where he demanded the wives of senators be offered as sacrifice was madness or an echo of ancient ritual, and how these debates were preserved not in marble inscriptions but in soft, hurried script in the margins of scrolls no one dared read aloud. There was a time when the Vestal virgins were not just guardians of the flame, but whispered to be the lovers of powerful men, protected by their sacred status but never truly untouched. And Gaius had once seen with his own eyes a senator's wife slip into the garden behind the Temple of Mars late one evening, trailed by a man in a soldier-esque cloak, who did not return until long after the moon had risen. As he wrote the image of Livia woman from his youth surfaced like a ghost rising from the Tiber. She was the daughter of a patrician, eyes the color of morning, sky voice like warmed honey, and though she wore her stola and palla with dignity, she had once whispered to Gaius that every night she dreamed of being a dancer in a tavern near the Forum Boreum, where men threw coins and promises in equal measure. Gaius smiled sadly at the memory, his stylus scratching faster now, recalling how Livia had read Sulpicius' poetry to him while they lay beneath a fig tree, her fingers tracing verses that spoke of women who loved boldly and without apology, of passion unchained from duty, and how even then the idea that Roman women were shy and submissive seemed to crumble in the face of Livia's laughter. He paused only to drink from the copper jug beside him, the wine bitter and old, and then continued, remembering how every Saturnalia the city transformed into a fever. Dream masters served slaves, rules reversed, and behind closed doors every taboo was made sacred. Through laughter and chaos, while painted boys in golden sandals danced with matrons in wolf masks, and the sound of flutes rose above the rooftops like a hymn. And there was the story of a gladiator named Titus, who became the lover of a senator's son, both beautiful, both doomed, on how their affair was sung in secret among theater performers, the verses careful to hide their names, yet everyone knew. And when Titus fell in the arena, the senator's son wept openly in the stands, his tears a scandal and a legend. The ink on the scroll dried too quickly as he wrote of the peculiar habits of Roman bathhouses, where bodies mingled with no shame, old men discussing politics while being oiled by young attendants, women gossiping behind silk screens while attendants massaged perfumed oils into their thighs. And in private rooms, senators met courtesans whose wit was as sharp as their eyeliner. Gaius recalled the tale of Marcella, a woman famed not for her beauty but for her mind, who ran an academy disguised as a salon where students came to study rhetoric and left knowing the art of seduction, and how one of her pupils became a consul whose speeches swayed the Senate, and whose private life was a string of carefully concealed affairs with poets and actors. He remembered to the graffiti in Pompeii carved by idle hands before Vesuvius silenced the town lovers' names etched beside crude drawings, boasts of stamina and desire, verses that rhymed lust with loyalty, and one scroll that read, "I gave my heart to Julia, and she returned it with a coin," speaking of the eternal dance between affection and transaction. As night deepened and torches outside the shop flickered in the breeze, Gaius's hand began to cramp. But he could not stop, not when the stories kept pouring out. The tale of the priest of Bacchus who was exiled for teaching boys how to find ecstasy in prayer and wine, or the widow who posed as a man to fight beside her lover in Germania, their bodies found side by side, swords in hand, lips still touching. He thought of how Roman weddings were not always about love, but sometimes they were the young baker who married the tanner's daughter despite her limp, and how the whole street celebrated when she bore him twins, or the playwright who dedicated every line of his tragedies to a woman who never answered his letters but inspired 3 of Rome's greatest theatrical triumphs. Gaius dipped his stylus again, the ink dark as the thoughts in his mind, writing how the gods themselves were mirrors of desire, Jupiter, ever lustful and disguised, Minerva, untouched and powerful, Venus, both mother and seductress, and how Romans, in their rituals and festivals, mirrored the divine not through restraint but through indulgence, believing that to love, to lust, to lose oneself in another's touch was to momentarily taste immortality. He ended the scroll not with a conclusion but with a promise to write more, to preserve what was once whispered and hidden, to turn the forgotten into legend. And as he placed the scroll atop the others, now forming a small tower beside his desk, he looked out the window at the moon hanging low over Rome, and whispered, "This too is history." And so, as the dusty summer air hung heavy over the eternal city, Gaius leaned once again against the weather-worn arch of his shop on the Via Subura, his gaze drifting toward the western sky, where the sun painted amber streaks across the rooftops of Rome, the scent of baked bread, olive oil, and faint perfume mingling with the noise of the city settling into dusk and the scroll beneath. His ink-stained fingers began to whisper the next memory that needed to be preserved, for it was not merely a recounting of the pleasures and peculiarities of Roman intimacy, but the pulse of life itself in all its indulgent vulnerability. The tale, still raw and half-shaped in his thoughts, followed a woman named Livione, not the empress but a freedwoman once belonging to a senator's household who had, against all odds, risen to command her own modest domus in Trastevere, where the wild vines climbed the crumbling bricks and the scent of river reeds drifted in from the Tiber at night. A woman whose story bridged the boundaries of class and desire with an elegance that made even the poets pause. Livia, born to a Greek slave and a Gallic soldier, was sold young to the house of Senator Gellius, where she had grown from a silent servant into a captivating presence, learning the tongues of both her bloodlines and those of the Roman elite. And when her mistress, stricken with envy and suspicion, banished her to the outer kitchens, it was there, amid the scent of garum and firewood, that Livia began to taste the freedoms that secrecy afforded. At first it was only glances, furtive, breathless exchanges across the gardens with the senator's second son, Marcellus, whose youthful arrogance masked a genuine curiosity and hunger for conversation that went beyond what his tutors could provide until one evening, as the household celebrated Saturnalia with raucous laughter and veiled masks, Livia and Marcellus disappeared into the atrium's shadows, where their whispered Latin mingled with Greek endearments, and the clatter of dice and drunken songs drowned the hurried rhythm of new ecstasy. Their encounters were like stolen verses from Ovid, hidden in the folds of routine, pressed between layers of linen, and stolen moments behind columns. But they also spoke of the complexity of Roman intimacy, where power and affection, ownership and longing, often danced in unsteady balance. And even as Marcellus swore he'd grant her freedom and legitimacy, Livia knew the truth written into the very stones of the domus. A woman like her could only ascend if she played the game better than those who owned the board. So she learned it not just the arts of touch and seduction, but the nuances of conversation during convivium, the politics of pleasantries, the measured silence that passed for wisdom among Rome's elite. And when, at last, Gellius manumitted her after Marcellus left for campaign in Parthia, Livia did not weep but walked out through the villa's gates with the bearing of a matron and the fire of a Vestal priestess who had seen the secret world beneath the marble. She purchased a narrow domus with her saved coin and gifts, small, dignified, perched above the fishmongers and candlemakers, where she hosted private gatherings, not unlike the symposiums of old Greece attended by scholars, lonely wives of equestrians and young men of letters who sought something beyond the rigid formulas of the forum and the temples, a place where body and mind could be fed in equal measure. There, under lamplight and behind veils of silk, debates raged about the nature of pleasure and virtue, about whether Venus favored the married or the mischievous, whether the gods judged the desire between two men more harshly than that between a senator and his slave. And Livia, with her husky voice and clever parables, became both hostess and oracle. She welcomed all, but required discretion. The wine flowed, the figs were sweetened with honey, and the stories that emerged from those nights became legend of a Vestal virgin who wept for a gladiator, of a praetoress daughter who learned to play the cithara with her feet to impress her blind lover, of two scribes who, after a single debate, never left each other's side again. Always, Livia listened, recorded, absorbed. Gaius had heard of Livia in whispers and song fragments, and it was only after many seasons that he visited her, then silver-haired and still luminous, her eyes reflecting the flickering oil lamps as she told him, "Pleasure is not rebellion, scribe, it is remembrance, it reminds the soul it is not dead." And so Gaius wrote the candle flickering beside him as outside the night deepened and the sounds of Rome softened to a hum, and the name Livia took its place alongside countless others in the scroll of lives, half remembered, the ink still wet with the breath of those who dared to feel. But no tale in Rome could rest for long. not when the city's appetite for sensation was matched only by its skill in forgetting. And as he turned the page, Gaius began the next chapter, one that wandered beyond the domus and symposium, into the streets where painted women beckoned beneath red-tinted lamps, and men with laurel wreaths staggered home from feasts, where the eros of the common folk bloomed in alleyways and bathhouses, in the warm corners of insulae and the shadows of arches long since crumbled. There was a man named Publius, a cobbler by trade, who lived above his shop near the Subura, a district notorious for its filth, fire, and festivities, and despite his gnarled hands and soot-lined nails, he was known not just for his sandals but for his voice which sang arias, so sweet that the night watchmen paused on their rounds just to hear him, and it was through song that he fell in love. She was called Nemea, a fruit seller's daughter whose stall was framed by lemons and pomegranates, whose laughter carried like spring wind through the slums, and when Publius sang from his window above, she began to linger beneath, pretending to rearrange figs, while her cheeks flushed and her heart pounded like the hooves of chariot horses in the Circus Maximus. Their courtship was innocent clandestine, yes, but clothed in the rituals of shared bread, secret smiles, and fragments of poetry borrowed from the streets in Tilwan Lupercalia. As the city was awash in wolf pelts and fertility rites, Nemea climbed the narrow stairs to Publius's room with a basket of overripe peaches and a daring in her eyes that would make even the Empress blush. Their union, though lacking pedigree or coin, was a vivid mirror to the elite's more veiled escapades, full of trembling exploration, the awkward grace of first touch, the humor of misunderstood gestures, and the sacred silence that falls between two bodies who have chosen to trust. And Gaius, as he imagined their breaths mingling above the worn wool of a single shared blanket, smiled and remembered the power of simplicity in a city drowning in excess. He would go on, of course, of the perfumed courtesans who advised senators in bed and in battle, of the eunuchs who served in secret with loyalty deeper than blood, of the artisans who carved lovers' names into clay lamps, of the mothers who taught their daughters both modesty and mischief. But for now, the quill slowed, the candle's wax spilled over the edge, and the scribe closed his eyes. For tomorrow he would write again, and the streets of Rome, with all their whispered truths, would offer yet another name, another night, another story. As the dimming sun spilled gold across the ancient rooftops of Rome and the day faded into a hush of violet dusk, Gaius remained hunched in the back corner of his quiet little bookshop along the Via Secca, his stylus moving steadily across the smooth wax tablet as he recorded stories long whispered and half-remembered tales of intimacy, of love both carnal and tender, of rituals and laws and secret moments exchanged in the flickering candlelight of forgotten villas. For he had become a vessel for those buried voices, a keeper of Rome's silent passions, and tonight his mind turned to the whispered cults that worshipped desire as divine, the secret rites of Venus Classina and Fortuna Virilis, whose celebrations hid deeper meanings beneath the perfume and laughter, where women and men alike crossed thresholds of modesty not out of shame but reverence, and how the matrons of the Aventine would gather in springtime to offer incense and prayers not just for fidelity but fertility, their white stolas brushing against marble altars as they asked not only for children but pleasure, for Rome's gods were never prudes, and pleasure in their eyes was neither sin nor weakness, but a form of gratitude. He wrote of how, in the quiet tricliniums of domus and the bustling upper rooms of taverns, patrons and prostitutes alike knew that desire was a dancer performance, often begun with poetry and finished in sweat, and how the lines between affection and transaction were sometimes blurred, as was the case with Flavia, a freedwoman of considerable charm, who became the muse and lover of a senator twice her age. Their letters still preserved in the margins of an old law book, and how their passion, though condemned by some as folly, endured for years, and inspired verses that made it into anthologies recited in the forum by blushing students, even if the names had been changed to avoid scandal. He remembered to the rare but real love stories between men that surfaced in the faded graffiti of Pompeii, where phrases like "Lucius loves Marcus more than wine" or "Antonius, come back to me" carved into stone, proved that love in all its forms had never been confined to rules of the Senate or scribes of law, and how some Emperors Hadrian most notably did not hide such affections, commissioning statues and temples for their beloveds, such as the divine Antinous, whose beauty was said to rival the gods, and whose death had cast a long shadow over Hadrian's heart, prompting him to deify the youth and spread his cult across the empire, where young men lit candles not just in awe but longing. Gaius' hand slowed only when his thoughts became too heavy, and he rose from the desk to pour himself a small cup of honeyed wine, sipping it slowly as the candlelight trembled across the shelves around him, rows upon rows of scrolls and tablets now echoing with the weight of all he had learned, not just the acts, but the emotions, the context, the reasons why these stories mattered, why they endured, and how even in the mightiest empire the world had ever seen, it was the small human gestures, the brush of a hand, the letter slipped beneath the door, the whispered name in the dark that defined what it meant to be alive. He returned to his seat with renewed clarity, for he now felt ready to explore the lives of those not often mentioned in grand speeches or triumphal processions, the bakers and the barmaids, the stable boys and scribes, the unnamed thousands who found joy in each other's arms, not because of lineage or law, but simply because the heart willed it. And he wrote of Junius, a grain merchant from the outskirts of the Aventine who fell for a fishmonger named Daria, their courtship unfolding over spilled olives and stolen glances in the early hours of the market, and how despite her father's protests and his own modest dowry they eventually married in a humble ceremony behind the market stalls, blessed by a wandering priest and serenaded by children clapping tambourines, and how their marriage lasted not because of status but humor, trust, and Daria's belief that love was best measured not in coins, but in shared bread and quiet mornings. Gaius smiled as he scribbled, warmed by the memory of such tales, and he thought of how, even in the grand baths of Capricalla, amidst steam and splashing stories unfolded not always scandalous, sometimes simply sweet, like the young slave boy who learned to write by copying love, notes left behind by others, and how he eventually composed one of his own hidden beneath a bench for a visiting mosaist, who returned the next day, blushing, and left behind a small tile shaped like a heart, and how years later they would open a modest art school near the Tiber, teaching not just tesserae but tenderness. He wrote late into the night, and the sounds of Rome grew faint beyond the shuttered window, but his candle still burned bright as he turned now to the complexities of Roman law, where sex and status collided with brutal clarity, how a citizen could bed a slave without legal consequence, yet a free woman who dared seduce a nobleman might find herself accused of witchcraft or treason, and how the Lex Julia sought to tame adultery not for morality but control. For Augustus knew that controlling private desire was another way to bind the public to the state, and so punishments were devised, banishments declared, and yet, despite these strictures, desire refused to be tamed, slipping between edicts like water through marble cracks. He pondered the contradictions, how a Vestal virgin caught in passion was buried alive for breaking vows, yet a gladiator could rise to fame and fortune through the affections of wealthy matrons, who left him gold and perfumes in the sand of the Colosseum, how women were taught to be modest but purchased mirrors rimmed with erotic scenes, and how men swore by Mars and virtue while hiring poets to pen odes to their lovers' toes. And in this clash of honor and hunger, Gaius found not hypocrisy but humanity. For what empire could stand so long if not built on both strength and softness? His final entry that night was of Livia, a healer from Trastevere, who treated lovers' ailments with herbs and prayers, whispering blessings from forgotten Etruscan gods as she pressed salves onto trembling skin, and how she kept a hidden ledger not of coin but of confessions, who loved whom, who feared discovery, who longed for escape, and how when she died her patients wept, not because they had lost a physician, but because they had lost someone who had made their love feel holy. And as Gaius closed his tablet and snuffed the candle, he knew this was not the end, for the city still breathed around him, and its walls still remembered, and tomorrow he would begin again, listening for the stories the stones longed to tell. For Rome had many faces, but its heart was always human. As the shadows of dusk fell gently over the city of Rome, Gaius leaned back against the weathered marble pillar just outside his shop, the scroll he had earlier been reading still resting loosely in his hand, and he looked out at the flickering torches that were slowly being lit along the Via Sacra, watching as slaves and street performers and nobles and beggars alike passed by beneath the golden-orange glow that made every cobblestone shimmer like the skin of a living creature. And for a long moment he said nothing, only breathing slowly and feeling the cooling evening air wrap around his limbs like a silk cloak, while somewhere deeper in the belly of the city a lyre sang sweet notes that drifted on the breeze, distant and calming like the echoes of a dream half forgotten. It was on such evenings that his thoughts often turned to those stories he had once been too afraid to write. The tales of women who were far more than wives or slaves or priestesses of men, whose pleasures were more than acts of conquest or duty of lovers, who had no statues but lived fiercely in the hidden corners of taverns and terraces, whose voices had been drowned by time, but still whispered to him through fragments, through ink stains, through quiet gasps, shared between candlelight and forbidden glances. And so Gaius stepped back inside, his heart steady but his breath deep, and he placed the scroll gently onto his desk, its surface already filled with stories both ancient and his own. He dipped his stylus in ink and began to write again, letting the night guide him, letting the city's heartbeat become the rhythm of his sentences. And this time, he wrote of a young Vestal virgin named Callia, not the chaste symbol history remembered her as, but the brave, curious, and quietly rebellious soul who had fallen in love with a Greek actor named Thalos, a man who performed tragedies in the Forum and who made her laugh beneath her veil during festival days. Their touches brief but electric, their meetings carefully timed behind the temple gardens where the laurel trees grew thick and the moonlight barely reached, and, though their love could have brought ruin, even death, it was not fear that marked their nights, but the passion of stolen freedom. He wrote of their final meeting, the night before she was to take her final vows, when they stood barefoot on the cold marble of the temple floor, hands trembling as they touched for what might be the last time. And he remembered her whispering that if the gods truly punished love, then perhaps the gods themselves had never been in love, and Thalos pressing his lips to her forehead as if sealing a prayer to her skin. Both of them knowing the choice she would make, and yet still honoring the beauty of what they shared, no matter how brief. Gaius paused, his hand stained black from the ink, and he looked up at the flickering oil lamp above him, its flame small but unwavering. And he thought of all the Celias who had ever lived, those whose names would never be etched in marble, whose stories would never be performed in amphitheaters, but who had lived love that was real, breathless, terrifying, and true. And with that thought anchoring him, he turned the page and continued. Next came the tale of Marius, a former gladiator, who had once drawn cheers from tens of thousands in the Colosseum, whose muscled arms bore scars not only from blades, but from the punishments of masters who profited off his flesh, but who upon gaining his freedom had chosen to open a bathhouse near the Tiber, where soldiers and senators alike came not only to cleanse but to be touched, to be healed, to be seen in ways the public world would never allow. And it was there that Marius met a blind poet named Dacius, who spoke of stars he had never seen but could describe better than any astronomer, and whose hands mapped Marius's body like a landscape of constellations. Their story unfolded slowly, quietly, not as fire but as embers that never faded, and Gaius wrote of how Marius would wait by the bathhouse entrance each night, listening for the soft tapping of Dacius's cane, the rhythm of his approach more intimate than a lover's whisper, and how in a Rome filled with roars and commands, they created a sanctuary of silence where breath and touch and murmured verse became their shared language. He remembered, too, the laughter of boys who swam naked in the aqueducts at dusk, chasing each other beneath archways while the city above bustled with the politics of empire, their games innocent yet charged, unaware of the weight their desires might one day carry, and how one such boy, Publius, son of a patrician, would one day write erotic poetry under a pseudonym, hiding his truth in verse that became wildly popular among the elite, and yet never revealing himself for fear of bringing shame to his family's name. And Gaius thought of how many Publiuses had written, drawn, sculpted, danced under false names, their genius hidden by fear and yet still immortalized in the art they dared to release. Gaius leaned forward, his back aching, but his mind burning with the weight of these lives, and he wrote deeper into the night, the candle wax dripping down like soft rain, and in every sentence he composed, he imagined the hands that had once touched in secret, the eyes that had locked across crowded streets, the breaths that had caught in throats during moments of almost saying it, almost doing it, almost being seen, and yet somehow still loving, still living, still surviving. He wrote of a matron named Livia who had grown tired of her husband's dull routines and nightly demands, and who found solace in the company of her female scribe, a clever and sharp-tongued woman who could recite Homer from memory and whose fingertips knew the contours of Livia's spine better than her own reflection, and they would sit together in the garden alcove at twilight, sipping diluted wine, letting their knees brush just enough to quicken their hearts, and sometimes, when the villa was empty, they would slip into the bath together, where the water masked their gasps and the marble echoed only silence, and as Gaius filled the parchment with their laughter, their secrets, their tender rituals, he felt the city outside his walls shift and grow quieter, the sounds thinning to a hush, as though Rome itself was listening, holding its breath as he brought to life what had been lost or silenced or scrubbed away by centuries of shame and conquest and law. And he realized that what he was writing was not just history, it was resistance, it was remembrance, it was love preserved. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, and in the stillness he imagined walking through a different Rome, not the one of emperors and generals, but of whisperers and dreamers, of poets and lovers, of hidden doorways and knowing glances and nights filled with stories passed from lips to lips. And in that vision, he saw himself not as a simple scribe, but as a lantern-bearer carrying light into the forgotten corridors of time. So he opened his eyes, dipped the stylus again, and began to write anew. As the day stretched toward noon, the Roman sun poured golden light through the worn shutters of Gaius's modest shop, illuminating the scrolls stacked like forgotten relics of memory, and he continued his quiet ritual, reaching for the next document nestled beneath a dusty bronze stylus. The parchment was brittle with age, tied in coarse twine, and as he unrolled it, he noticed the ink had faded into a rust-colored whisper, but the title remained legible, The Widow of the Vicus. The tale began with an older woman named Calpurnia, once the wife of a prosperous merchant whose sudden death left her both wealthy and watched. In Rome, a widow with coin was not pitied, but haunted by suitors, schemers, and neighbors alike, and Calpurnia, wise to the currents beneath society's surface, kept her mourning veil long after her grief had passed. Behind her modest facade on the Vicus Tuscus, she crafted a quiet empire loaning coin to struggling traders, offering sanctuary to girls who fled cruel masters, and most unusually, hosting literary salons by night. It was said that within her home, poets and prostitutes drank from the same cups and debated Cicero as equals. Among her frequent guests was a young orator named Aelius, whose words could move mobs, but whose stammer in private exposed his tender uncertainty. He fell in love with Calpurnia not with haste, but with awe, and their bond, though never publicly declared, became the anchor of both their lives. He read to her from scrolls she had preserved from her late husband's travels, fragments of Egyptian hymns and Babylonian verse, and, in the warmth of her lamplit library, he found not just inspiration but the courage to become who he was meant to be. Gaius paused. He had heard of Calpurnia in whispers, in rumors that filtered through Rome's gossiping elite, but here, in this simple scroll, her truth was quiet and profound. He reached for a fresh parchment to transcribe her story, determined to preserve it as more than a rumor. Before the ink could dry, a commotion stirred just outside. A young woman burst into the shop, breathless and cloaked in wool dyed the deep blue of merchant sailors. Her name was Syra, and she was not Roman by birth. Her accent marked her as Greek or perhaps Syrian, but her eyes held the same tired defiance Gaius had come to recognize in so many who came to his threshold bearing stories. She carried a small chest, sealed with bronze clasps and etched with patterns of the Eastern Sea, and she set it before Gaius without a word. Inside were scrolls, scores of them, each bearing names unfamiliar to Roman ears. but filled with tales of women who had crossed oceans, survived shipwrecks, escaped servitude, and shaped lives in the margins of empire. One scroll told of Amara, who was taken from her island home and sold into a senator's household, where she learned Latin in silence, stole knowledge where she could, and one night escaped wearing a laundress's tunic. Another spoke of Nisa, a dancer from Antioch, who became the secret lover of a Roman tribune, and who, when he was sent to the frontier and presumed dead, used his seal to negotiate the purchase of her freedom. Syra had come, she said, not to sell these scrolls, but to offer them refuge. She feared what would happen if the stories were discovered by the wrong hands, and Gaius, sensing the depth of what she entrusted him with, agreed without hesitation, and so part 15 unfolded. Not as a single tale, but as a gathering storm of many voices, women from the edges of empire, who had bled and loved and lost, whose names would never adorn statues, but whose truths captured in these humble scrolls echoed with the weight of lived experience. As Gaius read late into the afternoon, one name appeared again and again, a freedwoman who had once served in the imperial kitchens. Diona had not only escaped, but gone on to found a small school for servant girls, teaching them not just letters, but independence. Her scroll, filled with observations of palace life and secret romances among the elite, was sharp and precise, like a dagger hidden in a loaf of bread. Gaius copied her words with reverence, aware that each line was an act of rebellion against forgetting. Outside, Rome buzzed with the mundane chaos of commerce and ceremony, but within the walls of that little shop, history was being rewritten not by emperors or generals, but by a scribe who knew the value of a story and the cost of silence. By twilight, as torches were lit along the Via Sacra, Gaius leaned back, his fingers smudged with ink, and surveyed the growing pile of transcribed truths. Each scroll, each name, each heartbreak and triumph was a thread in a tapestry no official annals would ever weave, and yet together they formed the most honest portrait of Rome. And so part 15 ends not with an event, but a promise that these stories will endure not because they were sanctioned, but because they were true. Gaius lit a final candle and began the next scroll, heart heavy and full. As the rain whispered gently upon the terracotta tiles above, Gaius sat with a reed pen in his hand and a quiet determination in his heart, the smell of damp parchment and wax candles mixing with the faint aroma of wet earth drifting in through the open shutters. And as he dipped the nib into ink once more, he continued the chronicle of Roman lives and desires, letting the silent room bear witness to the story of Cassia the Vindress's daughter, who lived on the southern edge of the Aventan hill where the vineyards kissed the slopes with their lush green fingers, and where her days began with dew and ended with purple-stained feet. Cassia, whose laugh was like the clink of amphorae in the cellar and whose eyes held the golden flecks of ripened grapes, was known for coaxing sweetness from the sourest fruit and silence from the most boisterous men. And while her father tended to the trellises and soil, she tended to the hearts of workers who labored under the sun, weaving baskets with nimble fingers and sly glances, aware that power in Rome didn't always wear a toga or speak in the forum, but sometimes stood barefoot in the vineyard with juice on her lips and secrets in her gaze. It was during the Saturnalia, when order upturned and laughter reigned, that she met Titus Marcellus, a young man with a noble bearing, but roughened hands, the kind who rode the line between patrician and plebeian with a smirk and a shadowed past. And though he came to buy wine, he found himself returning for reasons he couldn't quite name, watching her as she crushed grapes with an intimacy that made his throat dry, her skirt hitched and her hair wild with wind. And he wondered if all the stories of Roman women being passive were merely tales told by those too afraid to know the truth. Cassia, amused by his awkward curiosity and drawn to the restraint in his eyes, took her time peeling him open like one of the late-season pomegranates, juicy and staining in those first meetings beneath the trellises, when the world was only bees and birds and the occasional rustle of vines. They learned that desire in Rome was not just about conquest, but about permission, about the space between fingers brushing and the breath before a kiss. And when she finally pressed her lips to his, it was not in surrender but in invitation, like a priestess welcoming the divine. They became lovers in the way that Roman seasons shifted, subtle and inevitable meeting in the old shed behind the villa, on warm stones beneath the fig tree, in the storage cellar among the amphorae of aging wine, their bodies learning each other like scholars to a scroll, mapping the geography of backs and thighs and murmurs. And while Titus spoke of philosophy and honor, Cassia taught him the weight of hips, the art of lingering, the kind of knowledge never recorded in scrolls, but passed mouth to mouth in gasps and grins. Yet not all things in Rome stayed hidden or remained untouched by scrutiny, and when word of their trysts reached Cassia's father, whose heart bore both love and ambition, he saw not scandal but opportunity, for while Titus was no senator, his family name still carried weight, and a marriage, though unconventional, could elevate their standing. But Cassia, who knew the value of her freedom and the danger of cages draped in gold, resisted, reminding her father and her lover that love in Rome, like the Republic itself, was a negotiation of wills, not a transaction of power. In the weeks that followed, as the vineyard ripened and the sun grew lazy in the sky, Titus wrestled with his desires and duties, visiting Cassia not as a man with a future laid out, but as one willing to unweave the tapestry for a chance to start anew, and together they fantasized about a villa of their own, where vines would grow freely and no names would matter, but those whispered between them in the dark. And even as reality pressed in with the weight of Rome's expectations, they carved a little republic within the chaos, a nation of two, ruled by shared hunger and laughter. And Gaius, writing now with more fervor than before, paused to stretch his fingers and look toward the street beyond his shuttered window, where the shadows of passers-by lengthened and faded. And he thought of how many such stories lingered like ghosts in the mortar of Rome as walls, and how the truth of Roman passion was not in the marble monuments or the senatorial decrees, but in the stolen moments of Cassia's breath against Titus's collarbone, in the soft grit of crushed grape beneath their knees, in the unapologetic joy of a woman who knew what she wanted and claimed it, not with noise, but with certainty. He turned the page and began again, this time telling of Marcus, the retired legionary turned bathhouse attendant, whose tale, like the next trickle of ink, would flow into the waiting parchment, and Rome, in all its carnal wisdom, would breathe anew once more. And so with the soft warmth of the early sun kissing the weathered stones of the Via Sacra, Gaius sat once more in his dimly lit taberna, the scroll before him, now weighed down not only by the wax seal, but by the burden of stories yet untold. And as the street outside stirred to life with the shuffling of sandals and the low murmur of morning prayers offered to household gods, he dipped his stylus in fresh ink and continued the tale that had haunted the alleys of his memory, picking up the thread of a night long past when Decima, the veiled Vestal virgin, who had dared to defy the sanctity of her vows, met in secret with Lucius beneath the shadow of the temple of Castor and Pollux, their breaths heavy with the danger of desire forbidden. And as the moon filtered through the fluted columns like 1,000 watchful eyes, the two lovers sworn to silence, by sacred law and familial honor, pressed palms in the hush of night, whispering not words of lust but of longing, of loneliness, of the ache of being seen only as symbols rather than souls. And in that fragile moment, as Decimus' fingers traced the curve of Lucius' cheek, she was not a priestess chained to purity, but a woman yearning to be touched, not by divine prophecy, but by mortal warmth. The ancient stones bore witness to secrets that would crack the marble hearts of senators and rattle the gates of the forum. And as Gaius scribbled the details, how Lucius had offered Decima a simple brooch shaped like a swallow, the symbol of fleeting springtime love, and how she had pinned it beneath her robes where no eye but hers could see, he paused, letting the weight of that memory echo through his soul, for he knew too well how even the lightest tokens could seal the gravest fates. And he wrote on about how, after that night, Decima's smiles became rarer, her walks more measured, and how her gaze, once fixed on the altar flame, now searched the crowd for a face she both craved and feared to see. And when the rumors began, whispered by matrons in the baths and murmured by slaves between garden hedges, it wasn't long before the Pontifex Maximus summoned her, his face carved of stone and his voice cold as the aqueduct's shadow at dawn. Gaius knew how the tale would end, how the punishment for a Vestal's broken vows was neither exile nor lashes, but burial alive, a ritual so sacred and terrifying that not even the gravediggers spoke of it aloud. and as he described the eerie procession, the city silent save for the slow beat of drums. Decimus, pale figure veiled in white, walking with dignity toward her tomb near the Carline gate, he did not spare the sorrow, nor the rage, nor the tremble in Lucius' hands as he stood among the crowd, eyes wide with helpless love, and the last thing she gave him, a final glance not of regret but of resolute affection, burned brighter in Gaius' mind than the midday sun upon the Pantheon dome. He took a shaky breath, then continued, shifting now to a different street, a different name, Cassia, a freedwoman of formidable reputation, known in the Subura, not for her beauty, though it was striking, nor for her wit, though it cut sharper than a senator's tongue, but for her unapologetic dominion over her own body and business, for in a time when most women were chattel, Cassia had risen, through calculated companionship and ruthless charm, to own not only the Lupana where she worked, but the hearts and purses of half the equities class. And Gaius wrote with a quiet reverence, recalling how Cassia turned her chamber into a salon of whispered politics, where senators would lie tangled in silk and ambition, murmuring tax reforms and troop movements between kisses, unaware that she remembered every word and sometimes, just sometimes, sold them to their rivals. And in one night of particular notoriety, Cassia had entertained 3 men from opposing factions, each believing himself the sole suitor of her favor, and, as they lay asleep, limbs slack and trust unguarded, she rose, lit her lamp, and scribbled notes into a ledger bound in goat leather, a ledger that would one day determine the victor in a consular election. And though some called her harlot and others hailed her as heroine, Gaius knew she was something greater still, a living myth of resistance in a world that demanded obedience, and he smiled faintly as he wrote, imagining the way Cassia's laughter might have echoed through her marble hall, shaking dust from old gods' forgotten altars. The stylus moved steadily now, as if the ink itself was eager to unburden centuries, and Gaius, pausing only to sip the sour wine left from last night, wrote of Aelius, the eunuch scribe, who served the imperial court and whose touch with ink rivaled any poet's tongue, but whose desires, unvoiced and unseen, lived only in the margins of his scrolls, where he drew delicate figures in embrace, eyes closed, lips almost meeting scenes of imagined bliss he dared not enact, lest he be whipped or worse. Pitied, and Gaius described the tragedy of yearning left to rot in silence, the bitter ache of a man who could compose entire treatises on ethics and astronomy, but never speak aloud, the name of the soldier whose laugh haunted his dreams. It was these tales, these threads of intimacy woven with peril and power, that gave the city its pulse, and Gaius, as the light shifted across the threshold of his shop, knew he must continue for the shadows of Rome, whispered, still begging not for judgment but remembrance, and as the bells of a nearby temple rang the hour, he dipped his stylus once more, and wrote on. As the rain washed down from the rooftops of Rome, and the clouds hung low like secrets not yet spoken, Gaius awoke before the light touched the cobblestones, his body aching gently from sleep, interrupted by thoughts of what had been shared in the candlelight of the Insula upper room, where Attica laughter and Sabina whispered tales had opened a new door to memories long buried beneath dust and silence. And as he sat at his table with his writing tablet, he paused to let his mind drift backward into the warm darkness of stories still waiting to be told, where the flickering of lamplight over bronze and parchment cast long shadows that seemed to reach across centuries and beckon him onward. He remembered the night Agrippina had arrived at the apothecary's courtyard, her hair soaked, and her robes clinging to her body like the wings of a frightened bird, her eyes wild with the kind of fear that carried not from danger but from the weight of knowing too much. And as Gaius took her hand and brought her inside, he could feel the trembling beneath her skin and the urgency in her breath as she leaned close and whispered that the scroll she had retrieved from the Temple of Venus contained a ritual so old that even the Vestals dared not speak its name, a rite not of fertility or protection, but of power exchanged through pleasure, a power once wielded by priestesses who no longer had names in the records of men. The scroll, worn and fragile as the wings of a moth, spoke of the Temple of the Seven Veils, once standing deep beneath the Forum in a chamber older than the city itself, where women chosen not by lineage or coin, but by their dreams, were taught to channel the divine through the art of surrender and the mastery of delight, and Gaius, as he read the faded ink by firelight, could almost hear the low chanting of voices long turned to dust, and he imagined the chamber round and silent, carved from stone darker than night, with frescoes that pulsed with life when the oil lamps were lit and bodies moved in time with the rhythm of breath and the sighing of gods. Agrippina had not come alone. With her was a man cloaked in the garb of a simple laborer, but whose posture betrayed a former life of Comanti, called himself Cassian, though Gaius doubted that was the name given to him at birth, and the way he observed the room, noting exits and windows with the eye of a tactician, made Gaius think of legions and borders, of broken oaths and forgotten battles. And when Cassian finally spoke, his voice was deep and slow, like the river in flood, and he said that the time had come to remember not just the acts of Rome, but the urges that forged it, the heat that stirred beneath togas and treaties, the moans behind marble facades. They sat together through the storm, and Agrippina told Gaius of dreams that had followed her since childhood, dreams of women with golden skin and eyes that saw beyond time, who taught her how to move not through corridors but through caresses, how to speak not with words but with touch, and how to awaken something in others that they had forgotten could be stirred. And as she spoke, Sabina returned from the bakery with warm bread and a look of curiosity that deepened into awe as she listened to the tale unfold. And when Attica joined them, still wrapped in her cloak, the room grew warmer, more alive, as though the spirits of the past had come to sit among them. Cassian spread out a map old, cracked, and drawn in ink that had bled with time, showing the hidden paths beneath the Palatine and Capitoline hills, tunnels used once by augurs, then by spies, and finally by lovers who wished not to be seen, and he traced a path to where the Temple of the Seven Veils might have stood, now buried beneath villas and bathhouses, forgotten by architects, but remembered by dreamers and those who listened when the city whispered in their sleep. And Gaius, heart-pounding, realized that the stories he had sought to preserve were not all in the past. They were alive, breathing, waiting to be found again, in stone and sigh and candlelight. The days that followed passed in a haze of preparation, with scrolls unrolled and copied, symbols sketched and studied, herbs gathered and ground into powders that carried scents both sweet and sharp, while Attica consulted old texts that spoke of rituals and veiled metaphors, and Sabina learned chants that stirred something primal in the belly. And in the midst of it all, Gaius wrote page after page filled with ink that seemed to spill not from the quill but from some deeper well. A reservoir of memory he had not known was there. And at night, when the streets grew quiet and the fires burned low, they practiced together the rites that the scroll described, not in mockery or lust, but in reverence, in curiosity, in the hope that through understanding the pleasures of the body they might unlock the secrets of the soul. And then came the night of descent, the moon, a sliver above the rooftops, the streets muffled with mist, the city asleep or pretending to be on. They moved through the tunnels beneath the city, guided by Cassian's torch and Agrippina's dreams, past chambers that once held statues, now headless, and alcoves, where coins still lay as offerings to forgotten deities, until they reached the round door carved with symbols that glowed faintly in the torchlight. And when Agrippina placed her hand upon it and whispered the name of the goddess that had come to her in sleep, the door groaned and opened inward with a breath of air older than the empire itself. Inside, the chamber was just as the scrolls had said, circular, with 7 pillars surrounding a mosaic floor depicting figures entwined not in battle or labor, but in embrace, each tile shimmering with a warmth that came not from fire but from memory. And in the center was a stone dais, smooth and wide upon which lay a cloth of gold and scarlet, and around the walls were niches with vessels of oil and perfume and instruments of bronze and ivory that hummed when touched, and as they entered none of them spoke, for words had no place in a sanctuary where truth was felt, not told. They performed the rite not as a reenactment, but as a living invocation, with movements slow and intentional, guided not by doctrine but by the rhythm of breath and the pulse of desire. And in that sacred space, each of them shed the masks they wore by day and became something older, something truer. And as the ritual reached its crescendo, a light bloomed in the chamber, not from torch or fire, but from within, a golden glow that wrapped around their bodies and lifted them into stillness, into silence, into the embrace of something vast and gentle and knowing. And when it was over, when the light faded and the air stilled, they lay together on the stone floor, breathless and weeping and laughing, and Gaius knew then that what he had found was not just history, not just stories, but a living lineage of feeling and fire, a chain of yearning that stretched back to the first sigh in the first bed of the first lovers, and he vowed then to tell it all, not just the wars and laws and crowns and crimes, but the kisses in kitchens, the touches in alleys, the moans in temples, the love that dared to outlast marble and empire. So he wrote, and he remembered, and the city around him breathed with him, its stones humming softly with stories no longer forgotten. The warm, coppery light of dawn began to pour slowly into the quiet alleyways of the Subura district, brushing against the soot-stained bricks and broken cobblestones as Gaius, now older and more deliberate in his movements, slid open the crooked wooden shutters of his tiny writing shop with a low creak, pausing only for a moment to inhale the sharp, earthy scent of the morning dew that clung to the mossy stones of the Via Sacra, and he wondered, as he always did at this hour, whether the stories he was etching into his scrolls would survive the slow erosion of time or fade like the forgotten laughter of slaves in the baths of Caracalla. The scroll he had been working on lay waiting atop the splintering cedar desk, its surface crowded with ink pots, worn reed pens, scraps of papyrus, and a small clay oil lamp that flickered defiantly against the encroaching light. And as Gaius sat down with a slow sigh, the aches in his knees whispering tales of age and toil, he dipped his pen into the darkest ink and returned to the passage he had left the night before, one that told of a Vestal virgin who had once broken her vow and found herself imprisoned beneath the earth, her story buried like her body, suffocated by silence. He wrote of the priests who condemned her, men who never knew her heart but claimed to speak for the gods and of the gods, who built the underground cell brick by brick, each stone a prayer for obedience rather than mercy, and of the eerie silence that followed her final breath, a silence not even the chants of the augurs could lift. And as he wrote, the shadows of his candle danced across the walls like the restless spirits of Rome's many dead. And he wondered how many others had suffered simply because their desires did not align with the Republic's expectations. Outside, the city began to groan into life, with vendors yelling about olives and fish, and children chasing each other barefoot through the alleys. And somewhere down the slope, a senator's litter creaked along the road, its bearers sweating and stoic, while the man inside dozed lightly under a silk canopy scented with lavender, dreaming not of laws or justice, but of a girl he'd seen bathing in the Tiber on a summer evening long ago. And Gaius knew that beneath the marble and the politics and the oratory contests, Rome was little more than a great stage where everyone wore a mask of duty, while the truth, love, lust, longing, regret lurched in the shadows behind the curtains. He turned to a new scroll, one that told of a foreign dancer brought to Rome from the East, whose movements could silence a crowd faster than Cicero's most scathing invective, a woman whose body spoke in rhythms older than the Forum itself, and who behind closed doors entertained senators who claimed to revile her in the daylight. And Gaius recorded every detail not to condemn but to preserve, because he had come to believe that truth lived not in the statues or speeches or victory arches, but in the messy, trembling moments of human contradiction that history often ignored. As noon approached and the light sharpened, casting long beams across the scrolls, piled around him like whispers of forgotten lives, Gaius felt the air change, as though Rome itself had paused to listen, and he remembered what the old philosopher had once told him in a smoky tavern. Write not what they tell you, but what you see in the cracks between their words. And so he returned to his pen, to the dusty stories of lovers, separated by law, of gladiators who found comfort in each other's arms before battle, of merchants who hid trysts behind crates of olive oil, of noblewomen who whispered secrets to their slaves in the privacy of their gardens. And with each long, deliberate stroke of the pen, Gaius layered one more truth beneath the official record. And as the shadows lengthened and the clamor of the day softened into the orange hush of twilight, Gaius laid down his pen and looked once more upon the city from his shop's threshold, watching as lovers met discreetly beneath colonnades, as courtesans brushed past soldiers with sly smiles, as mothers scolded sons who were too curious about the statues in the Temple of Venus, and he felt a strange peace settle over him, not because he had uncovered all the answers, but because he had learned, finally, how to listen to the questions the silence asked. And as the sun dipped lower in the Augustan sky and cast long golden streaks across the dusty rooftops of Rome, Gaius sat beneath the flickering oil lamp in his modest workshop along the Via Sacra, dipping his reed pen into ink once more, scratching the final lines of the final scroll of his life's greatest endeavor, the last echoes of the ancient world whispering through him like a lover's fading scent, the memories of bodies tangled in warmth and power, rituals wrapped in incense and wine, laughter and secrets exchanged in bathhouses and between silken sheets and candlelit domes. Bedrooms still as vivid as the day he had heard them from the lips of old courtesans and retired gladiators, aging matrons and cunning politicians, each tale weaving together the strange and sacred truth of Roman intimacy. And now, with a deep breath and one last look at the flickering flame, he wrote the final tale, a quiet moment in the life of a woman named Alia, a widowed baker in Trastevere, who had once shared her body with a praetorian and her soul with poetry. Her life simple yet rich with sensuality expressed in the kneading of dough, the warmth of morning bread, the fleeting touches of market flirtations, the memory of a lover's fingers, tracing verses across her back as if her skin were parchment. And it was in these quiet, common lives that the real Roman intimacy lived on, not only in orgiastic feasts or temple rites, but in the spaces between husband and wife, slave and master, friend and friend, citizen and stranger, where eyes met, hands lingered, and words were not always needed, only presence. And it was with this that Gaius leaned back, satisfied, his final scroll coiled gently on the table, his work done, his heart full, the city outside, still humming with stories yet to be told, but his voice had found its peace. And so, dear dreamer, if you've made it all the way to the end of this long journey through the beds and boudoirs, the streets and sanctuaries, the bathhouses and bedrooms of ancient Rome, I thank you for walking this winding road with me, for lending your mind and imagination to this gentle wandering through the whispered corners of history where people lived and loved not so differently from us, with curiosity, with awkwardness, with passion, with shame, with power, with tenderness, with boldness, and sometimes with quiet sorrow. And if any of this has helped you sleep, or stirred your thoughts, or made you wonder about the world before us, then I ask only this: please, if you found this soothing or intriguing, subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment sharing what moment from ancient Rome surprised or moved you most, and share this with a friend who loves history or simply needs a good night's sleep. And when you do, tell them to visit yesterday's video too. A day in ancient Rome where we walked hand in hand through the marketplaces, temples and taverns of the eternal city from dawn till dusk, witnessing the rhythm of a single Roman day, a perfect companion to the tales we've whispered tonight. Until we meet again in another corner of forgotten history, another time, another tale, sleep well, dear listener, and dream of ancient streets, under starry skies of laughter, behind closed doors of truths buried beneath stone and story, and of all the things we might still learn if we only close our eyes and listen. Good night. The boring historian sleeping.